My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with students and faculty of the Edward T. Rogowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. Carrying echoes of some of history's ugliest invocations of blood and soil, the Trump administration and its minions have unleashed an assault on the diversity that has long defined our country, which is supposed to be held together by constitutional ideals, not race, ethnicity, religion, partisan leanings, or even language. Came to a head in Minneapolis where the demonization of Somali immigrants was offered as a justification for an assault by masked federal agents that terrorized the democratic city, leaving at least 2 American citizens dead. The nonviolent resistance by a wide cross-section of Minnesotans is being studied elsewhere, including here in immigrant-heavy New York, where Donald Trump alternately threatens and then backs off plans to rein us in. This is a struggle for what it means to be an American that will not be resolved soon, as the administration continues to challenge long-established norms such as birthright citizenship, and they have signaled that Haitians in particular could be next on the target list. We're joined by 4 New Yorkers who take part in the debate over what this assault on immigrants and immigration means for our city and our country. Gail Brewer is a Manhattan City Council member who sits on the council's immigration committee. McElvey Neal is the special projects editor of the Haitian Times. Felipe de la Hoz is a journalist and an NYU lecturer who, among other things, founded the Borderlines blog and served on the editorial board of the Daily News. And Shirley Laro is a professor of criminal justice and urban studies at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, whose focus is immigration, deportation, and the mental health impact of the vulnerability to deportation. Felipe, I'm going to start with you to kind of give us the lay of the land. We're taping this as the war in Iran is, raging, the attacks on Iran and the counterattacks from Iran, which some think may be, an attempt to divert attention from kind of the ongoing disaster that came out of what happened in Minneapolis. Set the scene.
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been basically an iterative process where the administration does not quite have the personnel to have a focus of deployment like this in multiple cities at once. But so they've been kind of focusing these deployments on different cities at a time and sort of almost experimenting to see what they can get away with. I think the Minneapolis situation was probably the most aggressive deployment we've seen so far, not just because of the killings of 2 people who were, either protesting or simply kind of around, in the operations. But also, we've seen a willingness to violate court orders pretty perennially. We've seen, masked agents who have been authorized in part by the Supreme Court to do racial profiling and sort of stopped without really much basis, detentions of U.S. citizens, so on and so forth. And so, there is, I think, a concern that, there will just be a deployment now elsewhere that will be even more aggressive because it was not really curbed in the first instance. There's, some deployments now in Maine, and as you mentioned, there is concern always that they could do something like this in New York, which is not to say that there is not, immigration enforcement or, we could even just call it kind of crackdown because it doesn't really have to do all that much with immigration, in my opinion, right? It's a crackdown, at least in part, on speech and sort of politically, democratically aligned cities. But, there is enforcement here. It just hasn't been the same as the kind of very, very broad scale, very aggressive operations that have happened elsewhere, but it certainly is possible. You mentioned the Iran, situation that's ongoing right now. I do think that that's something of concern because viewers might remember that really the Department of Homeland Security itself was created in 2003 as a direct result of the fear in the post 9/11 environment. And so I think we're already seeing some lawmakers, right-wing lawmakers in particular, pushing for kind of Democrats to back off efforts to bring the contemporary DHS under oversight, kind of on the argument that we're now facing more of a vulnerability to terror and such. And so I think that that's going to be something to observe in the coming days and weeks, right? How that plays out in the kind of the other domestic debate about oversight and about Homeland Security and whatnot.
Gail, I must say we're going to try not to mention Jeffrey Epstein in terms of diversions, but in terms of what we've learned from Minneapolis. You went to a hands-off New York City meeting. I mean, this is the royal we. I mean, you sit on the immigration committee. You're aware of, what the city is seeing, what the city is talking about. Mayor Mamdani has this rather strange working relationship with the president, who seemed to agree to lift the arrest of a Columbia student who was picked up after immigration agents misrepresented themselves to last week, I believe. So what have we learned? What are we trying to learn? Where are we going?
Well, first of all, we should be very clear we're a sanctuary city, which means that the cops cannot aid those from ICE or any other federal agency. And we've had several hearings on that. I think people should remember that. And the second thing is that during the Adams mayoralty, just so we're clear, we did spend, and I thought it was a good thing personally, $7 billion on migrants who were coming for asylum seeking. And that was obviously before this current president in his second term. And then now we have a mayor who cares about this community, obviously being one himself. And we have, I think, a city council that feels the same way. Even before, under Adrienne Adams, when she was speaker, we had several hearings that even said ICE, we had to go to court against the Adams administration. ICE is not allowed on Rikers Island, period. And that also, these set some parameters for people to understand what the laws are and that hopefully speak to them. Now, with the second administration and Mr. Trump, it has been very invigorating and inspirational to see 1,000 people at a church last night on the Upper West Side learning about rules and regulations and people's rights. If your neighbor or if you see something, this is what you should do. Understanding badges, understanding uniforms, understanding what different aspects of law enforcement can do on the federal level. And then I went to a church, I don't know, a week earlier, and another 800 people showed up in tables run by hands off. If you live in the 70s, if you live in the 100s, if you live here, this is your neighbor.
And this is Hands Off NYC as a website where you can find where these...
Exactly, and they can do signal groups. They can find out what's going on in your neighborhood. People, huge turnouts. And I think it does resemble Minneapolis in the sense Minneapolis had those large turnouts and did neighborhood organizing. This is what people are interested in. With all due respect, they don't want to go downtown Manhattan when they live uptown, or they don't want to go to the Bronx when they live in Brooklyn. They want a local discussion, and they want to worry about their neighbor locally. So it's very exciting. A lot of students, but also a lot of older people, families, and all of this craziness. It was very exciting to see this kind of turnout.
McElvey, you are an immigrant.
Yes.
And, from Haiti.
Yes, I'm proud.
And the Haitians came under particular, frankly, grotesque attack during the 2024 election in Springfield, Illinois. J.D. Vance, the vice president, was particularly virulent in his comments. We're home to the largest Haitian diaspora. I think it's larger than South
Second
Florida.
largest.
South Florida is
South
largest.
Florida.
And what are people, people obviously are aware of what's going on. Is there heightened concern here? I understand from our conversation, people are leaving Springfield, Illinois, and Springfield, Ohio, and going to Columbus, going to a nearby city. Give us also a lay of the land.
Yeah, so Haitians are interesting. There are right now somewhere between 1.2 to 1.5 million of us in this country of varying status, right? You have people who've been here for 50, 60 years who are naturalized citizens, permanent residents. You have folks who are newer arrivals, some of them who came during the city's migrant crisis a few years ago. After what we saw.
Under temporary protective status, under what's called...
No, not yet. This is where it gets really complicated, right? Because coming into the border itself at the time was not a crime. Once you get here, you can apply for different relief, and one of those was temporary protected status, which was extended by the Biden administration at the time, but which originally was provided to Haitians under the Obama administration after the 2010 earthquake in Haiti that killed 200,000 people. So this is a very complicated history that we don't have time to get into, but the takeaway from that is there are Haitians here living under different statuses, the majority of whom are legal residents of the country. But for the sliver of people who may be undocumented, that has offered an opportunity for the Trump administration, and even for the newer arrivals too, who are again here legally. They've been used as a piñata, right? A scapegoat to blame for all kinds of ills that different cities across America may be experiencing. So for example, you mentioned Springfield, Ohio. The Haitian families who ended up there between 2021 and 2024, they didn't end up there by accident. The country was coming out of a crazy pandemic. The labor force was sorely lacking in many places. One of those places happened to be inland cities like Springfield, they needed workers, and they, advertised that they needed help to rebuild their city for many different reasons. And so we saw groups of Haitians flock to places like Springfield, Ohio, Greeley, Colorado, Charleroi, PA, places in Alabama that are very heavily manufacturing based, that have farm worker populations and all of that, because that's where the jobs were, and the country needed that manual labor to come back. So fast forward to 2024, we started seeing and hearing whisperings of the Haitians are taking over and invading our towns, including Springfield, Ohio. And we started covering at the Haitian Times instances of Haitian people being mugged at the gas stations, just trying to drive to work and come back, because you had certain people who felt like they were taking over their jobs, their benefits, government services, and all of that. Come to find out later on, a lot of it had started online with a lot of misinformation that was being spread about Haitians, not just Haitians, but other immigrants too, coming in and taking over these towns. So there were these fringe elements. In the Springfield case, I believe many of them were based in Kentucky, not even people from Ohio, based on what people tell us, that were spreading these lies. And one of them was the fake story about Haitians eating people's pets that
Right.
Donald Trump repeated on the debate stage with Kamala Harris. So that unleashed, it's a major debacle. So to bring us back, right after Trump was elected, unfortunately, people had gotten so afraid, so fearful, that he would immediately start the mass deportation promises he had made on the campaign trail. They did start to leave the city. They moved to other places nearby in central Ohio. Some of them left the state. Some people went to Canada. We heard people talking about going back to places like Chile and Brazil, since Haiti itself isn't really a feasible option that's safe for folks. So in the past year, since Trump has come in and issued his executive orders and threatened TPS, which was one of the many legal immigration programs that allowed Haitians to live and work here legally, we have seen people just really reacting to that fear. So from Springfield to New York City and Flatbush and other places, when we talk about the chilling effect of just the idea of him coming for the Haitians, that's what we've been experiencing now as a community. So what that means is people are making themselves small in many ways. They're not taking risks of going out. Some folks are not going to work. We've seen lots of different employers react and say, we can't continue to hire you or hire you back because we don't know what your status is. We don't want to run afoul of the law. We don't want to be targeted. We've seen lawyers, people who are in positions of leadership say, can you not mention my name in your reports because I don't want to be a target. So economically speaking, I don't even want to go into it because there's a huge effect in terms of how people are managing to feed themselves when they're so afraid. But I think the one bright spot is, as Gail said, there is a movement of seeing like neighbors helping neighbors, right? So both from people who are Haitian citizens, permanent residents themselves, people who are just American, like non-immigrants. We have seen a lot of resources being put out. The toolkits, the Know Your Rights rallies and things like that have been super helpful as the communities have tried to come to the aid to support Haitian immigrants.
Shirley, at BMCC, you've worked in health in the Bronx. Is there a level of concern? I mean, CUNY has a large number of undocumented students, let alone documented immigrant students. It's always been an immigrant path into the whatever passes for the American dream. What's going on?
Well, I mean, fear has always existed. I mean, my whole dissertation, which was during the Obama administration, was speaking about the fear of this, liminal
Who had
status.
large numbers of people deported.
Yes, I mean, the most of any, of all administrations up until that date, right? So deportation and the fear of deportation has always existed, even among, after I finished my dissertation and I was going around giving talks, that's what you do after you finish your dissertation. I mean, I had naturalized citizens tell me, I still fear when I cross the border, if I'm going to Canada or if they're on the plane. There's always that fear. But what I see now, in addition to fear, I also see outrage and anger because there's also a sense of betrayal by the people who purportedly were, on the side of a lot of our students. We got your back, and then, universities are always supposed to have always been kind of like this place of belonging, membership, for the students, and they seek support from their institutions. And when you see capitulation on the part of so many of these universities to the federal government's demands, they feel betrayed.
Including public university systems, not here in New York State, but Florida is the one that comes to mind,
Sure.
right?
But even here, I mean, you have ICE coming into campuses recruiting, right? Like on career days. It has happened across several CUNY campuses. Yeah, it's happened. I mean, it gets called out, and then there's always apologies, but why are they allowed on campus in the first place? But in addition to the anger, there's also action, right? Like, you're not going to take me away. There's also a sense that we need to fight for our position here. And then, where the officials who have the power and are supposed to support these communities, where they're failing, they feel the support from the communities, right? Hands Off New York, Rise and Resist. We have all of these other organizations, Northern Manhattan Immigration Coalition, which, some of them are now advisors on the mayor's immigration group, where the people in power who have the power to help and support are failing. They are feeling support from the communities, right? And so, for some of the students, staying in the shadows or retreating back into the shadows is not something that is an option for them. They don't want to do that. And this is why the community action is so important, right? And really just calling for our administrators and our institutions to really just step up for them.
But you, Felipe, in Trump 1, a lot of the guardrails held. The courts held. The media held. Major parts of the media held. Trump 2, you've seen the media consolidation under right-wing, under the control of right-wing business interests. The courts have permitted him. You referenced allowing racial profiling, which was pretty astonishing. Now you've seen them rein him in on tariffs, saying you have to go through Congress to get tariffs. And you have, maybe the tide is turning and the courts is saying we have to be an independent check. The biggest decision coming up having to do with birthright citizenship, which since was, involved a Chinese citizen back in the in the 19th century. Are the institutions holding?
I think, where we have gotten to where we are right now because of the collapse of institutional checks and balances. I mean, you mentioned the consolidation of media. I think that's a story of regulatory capture, right, in part. The fact that, we have kind of allowed for many years, for decades, there to be this kind of envelope pushing, And I think, you briefly
The
mentioned
incremental changes
Yes.
that become far and continue.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Epstein situation a little bit earlier. I think, everybody knows kind of the broader story of that, but I think the meta story of it is one of kind of elite impunity and kind of, a lot of actors working together to kind of destroy the ability of our system to kind of respond to corruption, respond to capture. So like this, with the courts, right? It's really the Supreme Court that has been using its power and the emergency docket to intervene continuously on behalf of Trump. The lower courts have been actually quite consistent in striking down a lot of the policies that have, that are in excess of the law. The lower
None of the
courts,
DHS policies, right?
right. I mean, there was a courts in, I think it was like West Virginia recently, a group of judges basically, chastise the government for just like continuous violations of
Well,
federal
they're
orders.
threatening now to hold government lawyers in
contempt, right?
contempt,
And that's
right.
kind of the problem I think is a lot of actors don't want to reach this level, right? There's kind of the presumption of regularity that exists where a lot of institutions are not set up for actors within the government consciously and intentionally violating the law. So what I think what's happening now is we're coming around to that view. I think in Congress, right, the sort of Republican majority at this time has been content to allow its power to be usurped by the federal government, but that may change if there's a change in the composition of Congress, and I think there probably will be, in after the midterms. And so, I think
Assuming
there has been
there are
a
midterms. Assuming there are midterms.
I know
Right.
there's a lot of concern about that. I want to make sure that we're realistic about the actual extent of the powers of the federal government. Canceling elections is not one of those powers, and they're controlled at the local level. So I think it's like kind of a picking your battles thing. We can't be fatalistic here about the things that are happening, right? And I think that there is albeit slow, but a clear reaction among both the population at large and among the kind of like remaining institutions. I mean, I've been kind of one of the people that's been banging the drum of a sort of a modern federalism here, where I also think states and localities have a very clear responsibility to respond and safeguard their populations. And I think,
Which is really interesting. So I want to get to Gail, but I want to come back to that point because I don't mean to date us, but Gail and I grew up when states' rights had a very different concept. It was resistance to civil rights. States' rights right now may be stopping.
Exactly.
I mean, it's really a flip-flop.
Yeah, we were looking for the feds before.
Right. But now, I mean, when he's talking about institutions, are the institutions holding?
Well, I mean, if you look at the numbers, there are, according to what I heard from 2024, 271,000 deportations. And then in New York State, in the last half of last year, 7,000 in the state and 3,000 arrests in New York City. That's only in half of 25. I would say that we're doing what we can, and obviously the Attorney General is doing what she can in the city.
The New York State Attorney General.
State Attorney General with Democratic colleagues. I mean, you sort of have one person that's holding up the legal apparatus in the right way for the whole country, these Democratic Attorneys Generals. And so you look to them, and then you hope that, Roberts, as the New York Times said the other day, has a little bit of sense about him in terms of the Supreme Court. But you look to the courts because you don't have much else. I think that the sanctuary city helps. They keep talking about it so people understand what it is something that I remind people. And as you heard, people sticking together and having these huge turnouts of neighborly support. But we can't look to the federal government. When we were growing up, like you said, we would, you hear about these stories in the South and you say, oh, please, federal government, show up.
It's just a remarkable.
And it's switched.
It's a remarkable flip.
Complete flip, absolutely. But I think that, with the...
and it still is uncomfortable to stand up for states' rights for me.
No, you're right, absolutely right. But I do think that there's, I am hopeful that the purple will become blue in some cases. All the elections that we've seen in Texas and elsewhere have shown that Democrats are winning. And I think that is exciting. And I think that people need to have success. We have so much negative. So when you hear about these little races in state senates around the country in quote unquote red areas, it gives you hope.
So, but I want to just, and everybody jump in. I mean, you were talking, McElvey, about how, in particular Haitians, but exposed immigrants, for want of a better term, immigrant communities that are
Vulnerable
that are
people.
that are exposed to this
Yeah.
threat, are seeking allies, understand they need allies. Are they finding them?
I think yes and no,
Right.
right? You mentioned the sense of betrayal before. It's very, like we've seen the external signs of people being out on the pavement, protesting in front of city halls and saying, ICE out. I think there was during Fashion Week a couple weeks ago, you had all these celebrities wearing ICE pins on their lapels and their clothing and all of that, which is very nice. But the conversations that happen in our newsroom with our reporters is how does that awareness or message translate to actual support for people who need to get from point A to point B without being pulled over for detention.
Or if you even get to point B,
deportation.
which is an immigration hearing,
Yeah.
and what you're required to go to, and you are taken at that.
Right. So there's not enough, I would say, institutional support in that sense where you'd say, okay, here's a group of lawyers who are ready and able to jump on a call with your hotline if you need help to go to your court hearing, which is something people didn't need before, right? Even basic things like the fact that the pause in TPS, temporary protected status, for Haitians, DHS had tried to end it on February 6th. Judge in U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. said, no, you can't do that because you didn't do your due diligence, Christy Noem and DHS, in announcing that the program would be terminated after then. You have to go do your homework. So they got really chastised for that. But what that meant was, at a concrete level, the people whose documents said valid until February 6th, the employment authorization cards that came with their TPS status had an end date of February 6, 2026. That end date is what a lot of states in certain areas, including Ohio, Florida, Georgia, New Jersey, use to issue driver's licenses, meaning that unless you're a fully permanent resident, we can't give you a driver's license beyond this date that authorizes you to be in the country. So when the judge said, no, you can't end this program willy-nilly like this, the driver's licenses a lot of folks had were still invalid as of that date. So then you had this friction of, the state DMVs now, motor vehicles, has to decide, do we extend the driver's license dates automatically for everyone indefinitely? Or do we, what do we do? So there's been this friction in the past few weeks, this uncertainty that has kept people from being able to go to work, to go to school. We reported on this one woman in Springfield, Ohio, who received calls from her school, her kid's school, of the bomb threats that took place right around that week that Haitian TPS expired. She couldn't get to the kid's school to pick them up because she didn't have a valid driver's license, because the lawyers had told them not to get on the road because then you'll be in violation of the law, and then ICE will have a legitimate reason to stop you and take you in and start processing you for deportation. So thankfully, she did have a neighbor she called on who had a valid driver's license to take her in to grab her kids from this bomb threat school, the schools that were shut down. But these are the kinds of everyday impacts that the tension or uncertainty or just pure chaos engenders between the federal government, the state government, and local and city offices and municipalities.
A lot of this, it's a lot of legalities, but it's a cultural issue. I mean, Bad Bunny, hosting the halftime show of City Hall at the Super Bowl was somehow this assault on the purity of America. I mean, he made a wonderful point. He said, people complain that Spanish is you know, it's not the first language of America. He made the point that English is not the first language of America either, because, you know, I used to work for the American Indian Law Alliance, which always said that they've been fighting undocumented immigration since 1492. So it's, you know, it's the cultural aspect of this. I don't know who wants to jump in on this. Is some mythical white America. As we move closer and closer to being a majority-minority country, it's always a very bizarre, as we are in this city, it's a bizarre concept, bizarre terminology. But how much of that is driving it? That's, you know, the MAGA movement to me is essentially...
It's been the driver from the beginning. I mean, every single immigration wave into the United States has been met with, you know, this nationalist opposition. They're taking away our jobs. I mean, almost every wave. I mean, the 1882, you know, Chinese Exclusionary Act, which, you know, lasted for way beyond the 10 years. You know, they kept renewing it. Every single wave of immigrants coming into the country have been met with, they're taking our jobs, they're raping our women, they're dangerous. Every wave. And it's always been driven by nationalism, right? So it's not new. There's no official language, by the way, in the United States. So, you know, this argument about English or Spanish, if anything, Spanish is one of the, you know, languages most spoken in the whole planet, right? But, you know, the driver's always the nationalism, and really it's the white Christian nationalism that's really, you know, since probably when you look at it, a lot of these things are cyclical, right? Like the language that you used, about how they're taking our jobs, and, you know, everything that the Haitians are experiencing. You know, every wave has like had almost like the similar opposition. But I think probably since like the Nixon administration, you started to see the Heritage Foundation and all of these other think tanks play a long game, right? And that long game is vilify until you know, actually justify, and then you have like, you know, buying up the news outlets, buying up, you know, where we get our media, where we get our information from, so that you can manipulate the populace into believing all of these myths that we know are not true, but, you know, they're convincing, right? You know, with Bad Bunny, he said, God bless America, and then he listed all of the countries, right, in all of, you know, America.
And he also pointed out that Puerto Rico is part of the United States.
It is the oldest colony of the United States.
And he had to do that because people don't know that. So.
Yeah.
You know, I'd say that it's like the language is consistent. It's the population that changes. So, you know, 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, right? A lot of the congressional discussion was like about the mongrelization of the culture and you know, all this stuff that people used to just say. And in a weird way, we're almost coming back to that.
It was Southern Italians. It was Southern Europeans.
Right. It was the Italians. It was the Jews. It was the Poles. Right. Those were the you know the Irish, the people that were then targeted, and now. I think, though, that there is a distinction that we're seeing lately that is concerning to me, because I think that there's a mask-off aspect to some of the language now.
But not Afrikaners, but not South Africans, white Afrikaners.
But, you know, like, so you know, DHS is in the middle of this big recruitment push, and I'm sure some of the folks here have seen, you know, there's been concern about some of the actual advertisements and such that they're using in the recruitment push that are, you know, increasingly referencing overt white nationalist material. Protect the homeland, you know, like kind of this great replacement thing.
Blood and soil.
Exactly. They're skirting ever closer to that, and it's like we've seen this language for a very long time, but we're used to seeing it coming out of, you know, these like tent network think tanks and fringe, and now it's coming out of official federal government accounts, and that is a change that I think is significant and something that did not happen quite as much in the first Trump term, right? I think there's a certain kind of cavalier nature to it now.
Also, there's a lack of shame.
Yeah.
But I think that change is the result of that long game.
Yes, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and I really do believe that it really started, you know, really hard during the Nixon administration. You know, after that, you started to see all of these organizations and think tanks think about how can we eventually get to, you know, white America, right? And, you know, finally, you know, like that's their end goal. And I think we're reaching the crescendo of that movement that started,
well, my
you know,
personal
back then.
favorite was in the 1980s, having lived through all that time with the moral majority. And one of the planks of the moral majority platform was support for the MX missile. And I kept looking through the Sermon on the Mount for where the MX missile fit into the sermon on the, fit into the sermon.
Well, as Ruth's best interest says, we're all immigrants, except, of course, those who were here before us. And people forget that. I don't know what kind of...
Yeah, but we've always
you have to say
wanted to lock the door behind us.
Exactly.
Is the point Felipe's
No,
making.
exactly. But I think that you have to keep saying that even though people forget. They do forget. They actually forget that they're an immigrant and that their ancestors started just like everybody else without a lot. Very hard to get across. But I think that's part of the culture, is keep reminding people, even though they probably prefer white immigrants than they do people of color. And that's part of the issue right now. But I think it's so exciting to have this city and much of America become majority minority. It's very exciting. The diversity, it is not a cliche to say that is what makes us strong. And in fact, if you look at the cities around the country that have strong immigrant communities, they've done better.
I was going to say, I mean, now that the rubber has hit the road, too, I think it's important to note people absolutely hate this stuff. I have not seen a reversal in public opinion of this magnitude, particularly around, public support for Trump's immigration policies. I mean, we're looking at, like a 30, 40-point flip in the span of a year. And so I think it's like when people really realize what this is and what this is about and what they want, it's incredibly unpopular.
Right?
Yeah. So it's like they're trying to represent this as some kind of, mandate. And I think the problem is we just had a lot of low information voters. And now that people are realizing what this all meant, it's very, very unpopular.
It's also, I've mentioned this before in this show, I covered the census when I was a reporter at New York Newsday. And in 1990, for the first time, Puerto Ricans were less than 50% of the Hispanic population in New York City. And what does that mean? This is relevant to Haitians as well. What this means is that demographic drives the issue agenda. All of a sudden, immigration is an issue that rises way up the issue agenda because Puerto Ricans are American citizens. Immigration is not an issue. Racism and how people react to them may be an issue, but the technicalities of immigration do not apply to Puerto Ricans, but they do to Dominicans and to Cubans and to Mexicans and to Salvadorans and to Nicaraguans. So let me stop for a second, take a question, tell us your name and your campus.
I am Maria Thomas. I come from CUNY Graduate School of Public Health. Thank you for sharing. My background is from Honduras, and to be honest, I never really thought about all the little details like the driver's license and how these people suffer, because my day-to-day is like school, where if I don't suffer it and I don't watch the news, I don't see it, right? But now I understand why so many of my people are invisible, like you don't see them outside as much. And I'm also a member of the International Student Club at CUNY, and some of them experience and share their fear. So I wonder, what could those students do? Because now they're like, they don't want to come on campus. They want to take the classes online.
Right.
So maybe I was also hesitant to speak, right? Because you never know. But I'm here today.
Well, I will say that CUNY does have a very solid infrastructure and support of immigrant students. I mean, almost every campus has an immigrant resource center. CUNY Central has, the immigrant help line. So CUNY does have an ability to help students. So I encourage you, even here at the Grad Center, right? We do have different offices across campuses for, to help our immigrant students. And I do understand the fear of, kind of exposing yourself. I would seek the office, if it's like a student, maybe the student government office, they can link you to the Immigrant Resource Center at your campus. BMCC has a Center of Belonging and Inclusion, and within that is an Immigrant Resource Center. All campuses, John Jay, many campuses have these. I would encourage you to seek that because CUNY does have, because of the large population of immigrant students and non-citizen students, right? Just overall, we do have a pretty solid infrastructure to help you.
Let me ask-
CUNY now also is
Yes, CUNY now at CUNY Central, yeah, so
correct,
definitely.
and they not only do they work with students, they work with all New Yorkers and have
Yeah.
massive forums with attorneys and support staff.
Most campuses have like once a month, they'll have like immigration attorneys come in and try to help some students.
It's through CUNY
with
now.
their, yeah.
It's phenomenal.
Yeah.
McElby, one of the other points she made is that people are, maybe not going to school. They're also not going to work. There's a fear. I don't get the sense that's as widespread in New York City because we're such a, culturally open-minded relative to the rest of the country. But that's clearly the case.
It's there.
In, particularly, Eastern Iowa, where you have manufacturing plants totally dependent on undocumented labor. But you get you talked about people being afraid to go to immigration appointments. Do you get a sense that people are like hunkering down and just saying, I don't want to be outside?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, New York City, it's a little bit harder to tell, but we do have instances where the WhatsApp groups will start just blowing up in the mornings of people saying, don't come out to Utica Avenue and like Snyder because ICE is out here doing an operation, right? So if you're on your way to work, what do? You come back home. Or if you're a school bus matron.
And those are
something.
widely used.
What's that?
Those apps, those WhatsApp.
Oh, WhatsApp, yes. There are groups in Creole language and English, all of it, right? There are people who are getting information in English from various sources and sharing that information with their family members and loved ones, relatives whose status is, shaky or mixed, as it were. So it's not like it's not really contained to one locality because it might be happening here. You might hear about it in Long Island with all of these, or upstate New York with the 287G agreements that local law enforcement, some of them have signed with DHS to detain people and keep them on a detainer for DHS to come pick them up. You hear about this stuff, but if you're not well informed, all you see is, oh my God, they're picking up people and rounding up, almost like with the paddy wagons, right? When they used to do stop and frisk in New York City.
I just want to push back. There's absolutely fear in New York City, and there always has been. As I said, my research was during the Obama administration, right, which was relatively friendly for immigrants because there was a lot of progress as well, right? We had DACA, but there was always fear. There's absolutely fear in the city, and you feel it. So, there's like this myth of like the happy immigrant in New York City. So there's fear all over.
I mean, even for me, I'm sorry, sometimes, but when they were, coming down to 26 Federal Plaza all the time, I'm a naturalized citizen, but I have to make a calculus of, do I go as a journalist to bear witness and see what's happening?
You carry your passport?
I have pictures of it in my phone just in case, right? We were doing that for a while. Some of us were defiant and saying no, let the chips fall where they may. But I'm not trying to be a martyr, and I want to go back home to my children at night. So it's like, okay, as reporters, do I send this reporter out to the story knowing that he or she has a TPS work authorization, right? Like, why would I ask someone to take that risk and put their livelihood at risk for a story?
Or even if you have your passport, what does that
Yeah,
matter?
it doesn't really mean
They don't
anything.
care. You got mass goons picking people up and discarding.
They
all
don't
of our
ask
rights.
you first
Doesn't matter,
if you're what your
They
status
take
is
you and then
before
they
they
ask.
pick you up.
We have a lot of African immigrants, and they were the target of the Canal Street sweep, which is probably the biggest sweep we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I was there in September, or was it October? There were two that were, the second attempted that they'd kind of botched and they never went out. But I was there for the first one, and, we saw down in New York City and, downtown Manhattan on Canal Street, similar tactics to what we've seen elsewhere, which is to say that, a number of agents were kind of just trawling around and grabbing people. I had been informed that their target were the vendors on Canal Street, and that was their MO when they were down there, which is to say they were grabbing people that just brass tacks like looked African in their view, and just kind of asking them for identification. And they arrested a number of people that they let go because they realized that they could provide identification. There were actually relatively recently a federal judge here in New York ruled that some of the arrests, even of people that did not have status, were themselves illegal because they were conducted in an illegal fashion.
Essentially a racist fashion.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not that, like there's no magical force field where, federal agents can't operate in New York. I mean, they are operating. I mean, they're operating in Queens, they're operating in Brooklyn, they're operating in the Bronx.
The Heights.
Yeah, exactly, everywhere. Like we just don't, it's not as much of an issue, a story, because it's not the same level as kind of other places. But they're here and they're, they're grabbing people.
But on the fear factor, housing authority, the housing authority has just been told by HUD, Housing, Urban and Development, that they have to provide the names of everybody who lives there. And then the housing authority is going to have to provide that if they do, and then HUD will compare it to who is a citizen and who is not. Talk about fear. And it could be your sister.
Well, we've had that for employment for many, many years.
I know, but these are people who've been living in an apartment for a very long time. It's very hard to find an affordable apartment in the city of New York. And it could be just your nephew who's on the lease and who is not a citizen. So it's very deep and very contrived and very scary.
How about this with the IRS, right? The Associated Press put out this story a couple days ago saying DHS had this agreement with the IRS to provide the names of people who were filed. 1.2 million people they asked for, because they were using a type of number.
The EIN.
ITINs, not EINs, ITINs. I might be getting the initialism wrong, but it's what people who don't have a Social Security card or EINs use. So they asked for those, and the IRS gave them 47,000 people's addresses.
Right, and that's illegal, but then it's like the genie's out of the bottle, right?
Like,
The housing, 86% of immigrant families are mixed status, right? So when you consider that the vast majority of immigrant families are mixed status, and then they're being told no mixed status families in Section 9 housing, then you're going to evict, almost like...
But that adds to the fear factor is what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
Which the fear is part of the objective, right? I think we should be clear about that, right? They understand that they cannot, it is physically impossible to arrest and deport, as many people as they would like to. But if they can achieve a secondary objective of having people live in perennial consternation and leave, because many people are leaving.
Self-reporting.
Self-deport.
Right.
Isn't that the term of art?
Yes, that's one of their objectives. I think, pretty explicitly. I mean, it was in Project 2025. It's been part of their rhetoric since the beginning, right? It's to try to make life untenable. And so, it's like they don't actually have to do all of the things that they would like to do in terms of enforcement, right? It's enough to make everyone scared that they will.
To violate your rights. It's
what
enough
happens?
to violate
Mental
you.
health crisis. We have a true public health issue right here because people are depressed, they're anxious, people are having suicidal ideations. You have an entire population of people who are experiencing trauma right now. And that's going to last. I mean, children are watching the fear of their parents. They are fearful. And so we are, mentally abusing an entire population of people and a significant population of people, right? And that's going to be the outcome. Not everyone's going to self-deport, but everyone is going to have a severe mental impact.
Reaction. Domestic violence cases we've seen are also up in certain places because people are literally stuck in the house.
Substance abuse is going to go
no
up.
outlet.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing is, I know a lot of the African communities, and they speak, Fulani, they speak English, they speak French, and they speak all these different dialects. We need them. Hello, we need this wonderful community. And yet that doesn't seem to make any sense to the people in the White House.
But when you say, we need that community, we meaning the larger American community, need that community for employment purposes. We need to fill jobs. That is, that's where the rubber's going to be meeting the road for the Trump plans and the American economy.
Another thing, I go to a lot of graduations. Guess who the valedictorian is? An immigrant.
An immigrant. We only have 8 minutes left. Let me get a quick question.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Cheyenne, and I represent Lehman College. So you guys have spoken about ICE a number of times, and you've brought up the issue of ICE being on like career fairs, et cetera. So I was wondering if there are any prevention measures in place for things like that, where ICE comes on campus, because like we said, CUNY, 26 campuses of different various statuses. We've also spoken about how everyone is in fear, not just TPS holders, et cetera. So is there a way that CUNY is protecting the students on campus?
Yeah, so after those instances and the outrage, right, that they garnered, there's now a definite obstruction for ICE to come back on campuses, right? But the whole point is like, why were they allowed on campus in the first place? And in some instances, they, the offices, somehow the students found out that ICE was coming to campus, and then they, protested or fought or, were very vocal about their pushback on letting ICE. So, I would say, I don't anticipate ICE coming back on our campuses, but it doesn't have to just be ICE. It's any, if I'm a criminal justice professor, right? And if you have a career event for criminal justice, you have ATF and DEA, have all of these federal offices that are also being used by DHS to engage in these activities. So we really just, I encourage administration in all campuses to just be really careful on who they're allowing on campus. I mean, who's more important, the student or the office that's coming in? It's a student.
And if I could say something, I think there's been a lot of confusion about some of the legality here, but at the end of the day, the administration tried to give itself the power to enter private property through administrative warrants. There was a memo,
administrative warrants, not judicial warrants.
issued by an ICE administrator, right, to enter private property, and they were doing so for a while. That is not tied up in litigation, and I think it's very clear, I mean, for anyone who's a serious kind of person on the legal side, that that's not lawful. And so anything that is private property, that is a non-public area of any institution, anything that's a home, anything that's kind of behind a gate or anything, institutions like this university, homes, apartments, stores have the right to prevent entry. Now, whether that's obeyed, right, or whether agents force their way in anyway, there have been instances where that has happened, but I also think like the importance of some of these know your rights things are that they're counting on people not being aware of these things. They're counting on people not knowing that they don't have to open the door for an administrative warrant. And the good thing about, people being aware of these rights is that even if that does occur and they violate the law, you can very clearly establish that they have violated the law, which does have legal ramifications later, for example, declaring an unlawful arrest or whatever. So, there's been some muddying of the waters here, but it absolutely remains unlawful for agents to enter, private property without permission, without a judicial warrant, signed by a judge. So I just want to make that clear.
But they're doing it anyway.
Sure.
That's and then the harm gets done. So whether it gets declared unlawful later, the damage has already been done.
But there is a lot of habeas corpus, there's a lot of lawyers, there's a lot of you're not going to leave New York. There's so much more information to be supportive than there was even a year ago.
But I think there's just not enough critical crisis response type of resources available. The flyers, brochures, and websites are there, but when people are in crisis and they need someone to advocate for them in whatever fashion, that level of support isn't there. You mentioned, for example, someone coming onto campus once a week or once a month. Similarly with, say, Haitian nonprofit organizations. They might have an attorney who specializes in immigration come in every 2 weeks or something to be available. But there's not enough funding to have an immigration specialist attorney to be available every day or at least 2 to 3 times a week. So there is a lag, and it is a little bit frustrating to see that the local and state level institutions are not responding as quickly as the vulnerable populations would like when they are in crisis.
You also have the gray, a lot of undocumented immigrants are live in the gray economy. They don't live with Social Security numbers, but that gray economy is critical to keeping neighborhoods going, to keeping major businesses going. This is not, to keep Donald Trump's hotel properties going.
All the delivery people.
The delivery people that, and you do see, stores saying, I can't take a chance of hiring you. So, I mean, this is.
I'm glad you brought that up, Bob, because with the TPS examples, removing it or revoking it or threatening to terminate it is doing exactly that. It's driving people into the shadows. 25 years ago, before some Haitians had the TPS program, a lot of undocumented ones did work off the books or under the table and right now. And they were subject to a lot of abuses, no benefits, none of that. With an actual EAD, like work permit, then you become eligible for benefits. Your employer pays taxes for hiring you, all of this stuff. With this TPS threats and all of the threats to revoke all these immigration programs, employers also are afraid, which impacts decisions they make about, how much they're going to produce, how many people to hire. And some of them who are less than honest will hire people off the books, pay them less, and then threaten them with firing them for the abuse. So it wasn't as great, at least not for Haitians. It hadn't been that gray for a very long time once TPS became unavailable relief.
Because of establishment of some status.
Right, the legality of it. But now just the threat of it being revoked is driving people to work in the shadows.
Basically, they were going to remove it, and the judge stopped them from removing it. That's
right.
the current
On a
status.
technicality, though.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
Well-
first term too, actually, they had the same litigation. Well, it's just, it's like we've been doing the same. They keep being ruled unlawful, these things that they're doing, and then they just try again.
It's very scary for people because there are lots of lawsuits. Then they change, and then it
Lots
goes
of
back.
lawsuits.
And there's not a lot of news outlets that you just described. So people go online, or they go to their Signal or their WhatsApp, and I happen to have gone to court. So I have young people who are in my house who supposedly will not get deported if they're under 21, who go to making GED, and then they do deliveries, right?
Yeah.
But they stay right, in that, I guess I call it gray area, which is the delivery world, because they know that they're safe there without having to go to an employer.
I do agree that there isn't enough help, particularly immediate, right, if
Yeah.
someone encounters. But I will encourage, when you go to an event like Hands Off New York or any of the coalition events, Rise Up, then what happens is there is like this almost like a telegraph system, right? So it's like, Gail, do you know an attorney? One of my friends needs someone. And it's kind of like the telephone game. There are groups that do that.
Well, that is the
We just need
informal
more.
economy. That's what,
We need more. We need more of those because there isn't enough. But there are groups that do communicate with each other. There are attorneys waiting. You just have to find them.
I always make deadline. We got 4 seconds left. Thank you. It's a spirited discussion. Unfortunately, I think it's a discussion we're going to continue to have. Thank you. We'll see you next time on CUNY Forum.